Humans have been using media for thousands and thousands of years. If you think back even to the cave paintings, which was like 37,000 years ago, people would go into a cave and they'd write a little note, and then, other people who came after them would see that. And then if you sort of fast forward several thousand years into the 16th century, that's the invention of the Gutenberg press. And of course, that makes mass communication possible. At that point, mass communication is controlled by a very small number of people, however, and so there are structures of power that are established during that time. And so if you jump into the 70s, the 1970s, this is the first time that we start to see the precursors to what we think of as the internet, so electronic bulletin boards. It's not that far to go from there to, say, 1991, when the internet was commercialized and people can now, businesses can now set up shop on the internet. Facebook in the beginning was about people throwing sheep at each other and poking each other and doing these silly things. Obviously now it has much more power. That social interaction, that ability for individuals to kind of communicate with each other and also self-publish is really the beginnings of what we're seeing now. And it's only 15 years old.
One thing I would say about early modern people is that they believed that the world was full of magic. And if you didn't believe in it, if you didn't understand it and have the right approach to it, it could be really harmful to you.
Magic is traditionally, in Europe, the ability of certain human beings to manipulate supernatural or preternatural power in order to help or harm others. The authorities, guided by the Christian Church, outlaw magic completely, in theory, because they regard the only response to the headache, the toothache, and the bad luck is to pray, to ask God for help. To try and work the system yourself is regarded as blasphemous.
It's funny, though, because, of course, clergy had their own magical practices, too, right? So for them, natural astrology was a science. You can use the Bible walking through your crops, in fact, to make them grow better. But you can't do judicial astrology where you find out something about your future, about the fate of you as a human being.
You would have people who said they were good witches, that they weren't doing anything bad, or mostly called cunning folk. But then you would get kind of more learned writers who would then say, actually, all this magic is coming from the same source, as kind of given by the devil. So it was very much kind of part of this battle between good and evil, between God and the devil.
My grandmother or maybe some of my friends that I grew up with to identify really sophisticated fake accounts on social media. It's even difficult for me to understand what they are. I often get tricked by them. And so the first line in any bot code of conduct should be that the bot account must say that it's a bot. Bot's just a back formation of robot, you know? It's just, it's a disembodied version of a robot. From Czech, what robot means is essentially slave. And so bot, in some ways, is a slave to the maker.
So bots are essentially automated programs that can do things in a faster, more efficient, and a more coordinated way.
Some bots are passive. They are deployed by the programmers to just basically collect information, and they're not outward facing at all. Whereas social bots are in the social space, and so we would encounter them more frequently.
There's a lot of bots that aggregate information and retweet information. There's some bots on Facebook and on Twitter that are completely innocuous, and many are fun or helpful.
Other examples would be there are weather bots that give you the weather every day at a certain predetermined time. That's useful. Even governments and civic institutions are now looking at deploying bots on their websites for the citizens to get to information in a more streamlined and more less onerous way.
Normally, the way technology has gotten developed is that engineers have an idea, they think it's great, they build it, and they launch it. So think about Facebook. Its motto is what isn't or was move fast and break things. Oftentimes, people are thinking more about sort of like the novelty of particular ways that the bot can be used to communicate, rather than thinking about necessarily how it might affect society or it might be ethically dubious. There's a huge bot-making community that build bots for art, that build bots for social good, that think about the ethics of bot-making in a very, very real way. And they've done a lot of work to think about how a bot should be built in a way that is ethical, in a way that doesn't manipulate people. And a lot of the time, the conclusion that people come to when they're building bots and working to make them ethically is that they understand that they have to identify the product upfront as a bot. Because a big part of the problem with social bots is that they are often mimicking real people.
And when we think today about the witch, we've got a particular stereotype burned into the backs of our retinas or the corners of our brain. The gnarled old woman with a palsied hand proffering the apple at the door. She's very akin to, I think, the storybook witch. Very often old, almost invariably poor, isolated, and dangerous. The village countrywoman, or man sometimes, in some cases, would have a little animal, a domestic pet. It could even be a bee or a tick that would do the particular bidding of its master or mistress.
In a lot of cases, the witch became a witch by being given a familiar. So a lot of the witches inherited them from dead mothers, dead mother-in-laws. Other witches actually just gave the familiar away to another person to make them a witch. In other cases, they also met the familiar, and when they were kind of out wandering, kind of desperately needing help, and then the devil would appear.
Sometimes they would say, "I am Satan, don't be afraid of me," which is a funny way to start a conversation. And you wonder why the person wouldn't have been afraid of them if they said they were Satan. But anyway, sometimes they would announce themselves very obviously, so the witch said subsequently. Sometimes they would be rather more circumspect, and they would come up to the witch and say, I know you're having some trouble with old so-and-so, I can help you with that, and offer their services accordingly. So familiars could be any kind of animal. They could even be things beyond animals. So you might find that your familiar looked like a man or an angel. But most often familiars were animals. So they were cats, dogs, birds, creatures that came to you unexpectedly, usually out of nowhere.
We get familiars which are a bit ghost-like, that they're spirits of the dead. We get familiars which really are just look like pets and companions who have been given this veneer because in other ways these people have been accused of witchcraft in other forms, and because they have a pet, and really do have a pet, the pet itself becomes part of this popular perception of a helping harmful spirit.
And then the familiar would accompany through your magical journey. And if you were unlucky, it would also lead you towards the point where you were accused as a witch and convicted and sent to prison, at which point the familiar would usually abandon you. So the familiar is a frenemy. The familiar is your friend, but it's also your enemy too. They're an enemy within. They're somebody who's worked themselves into your life and is betraying you quietly. So that's what the creature that you thought was a lovely fluffy cat is actually a nasty scaly devil who will lure you into situations whereby you will end up being convicted of witchcraft and possibly executed.
So on social media, if you think about bots as being an automated account that mimics a real person, there's several different types of bots that exist. The first one that's the most sort of simple is a bot that's built to like or retweet. It communicates to other people that you're popular or that your content's popular. And then there's another kind of bot, which which I call a roadblock bot, which basically tweets out spam. It's used to interrupt conversation. It can be used to try to get people's attention and to try to sell products. But now the bots get leveraged in ways that block communication between people during pivotal political events or during security crises. Take the Syrian civil war, for instance. The activists will use a particular hashtag with a particular word to signify that they're having a discussion that other activists should pay attention to, and you can search using that hashtag in the search bar. But what people have done, specifically people in positions of power in Syria and outside of Syria, is that they've built bots that use that, co-opt that hashtag, and then flood the search results with junk, so that any attempt to coordinate using that hashtag is then futile.
Typically, you're friends with people or you follow on Twitter people who have similar political opinions to you. Most of the content that you see is biased in the direction of the beliefs that you already have. And it's not at all clear how being exposed to false or misleading information affects your ultimate beliefs. Your actions have wide-ranging consequences, and you sort of have a civic responsibility in online spaces to do your best to pay attention and think carefully about what's accurate and what's not accurate.
The same tools that were used when the witch trials were going on are very much the predecessors of the tools we see getting used now. So the printing press drove the Protestant Catholic divide and drove people's perception of heaven and hell and what reality was. And the internet today is a very much amplified version of that kind of technology, wherein you can access superstition much more quickly. You can access bad information very quickly. We have to humanize dis and misinformation, just like we had to humanize and have to humanize the witch trials. Like, there was actually people then that were being killed. And now, in places like Myanmar and India, there are people being killed as a result of dis and misinformation. But not only that, the people that get targeted with dis and misinformation today are oftentimes the people that already exist on the margins. Because they're easy to scare, because they're already marginalized, they can be silenced. Back during the witch trials, the same thing was probably true. It was the people who kept to themselves that were targeted. It was probably people with difference that were targeted. I think of disinformation and misinformation as a means for distraction a lot of the time, also as a means for confusion. And because of those two things, what it really is a means for control. So when you get the public to zero in on a conspiracy theory, then you're successful at diverting them from something that actually matters.
A lot of these fears, notions, magical thinking is part of the human condition. And if the environmental or social circumstances arise whereby people start accusing witches again, I think it could happen, whether it's a catastrophic environmental change and human depletion, or whatever it is, and we see scapegoating as a fundamental part of the human condition.
It is a magical sense. We think of the internet as a magical place for some reason. Perhaps because it's so new and it's so technologically challenging, and yet it has so much potential. The relationship between something that's out there and the inner self of the person, and the way in which a bot, like a familiar, transgresses across that boundary and gets inside you and makes you do things, takes away your agency.
It is so difficult to accept that life is just potentially just a stochastic process where things happen for no reasons. And that thought is so unbearable sometimes that you explain what happens with miracles, with witchcraft. We rationalize it, but by doing that, we put things under some control.
How do we make sense of a threatening, hostile, unpredictable, and sometimes completely irrational world full of its misfortunes and its pitfalls? Well, sometimes magic or the familiar fills that void. It was 2 clicks of a computer mouse yesterday. It might have been a rat or a mouse scurrying across your hearth 300 years ago.